What shapes our thoughts? I think the answer lies in the structure of the brain, namely the anatomy of the brain, but also the organization of brain regions across the cortical mantle. Specifically, I want to understand how genes and environment shape the brain to produce behavior. These things are dynamic and not set in stone, so I don't believe that the genetic predisposition makes one think certain thoughts, but I do think that genes and environment help shaping the brain, creating certain thoughts. To answer my research questions, I look at 3 specific angles. On the one hand, I try to understand the anatomy of the brain, namely how the gray matter structure and the white matter structure are organized in humans, but also in primates. On the other hand, I look at the genetic basis of the human brain using twin studies to understand which parts of the variation across brains can be explained by genetic factors. Last, to fill up the parts that cannot be explained by genetic factors, I look at environmental factors impacting the brain, in particularly social environmental factors, such as stress, but also social support. These lines together help to understand also how a brain is structured in health and disease, and for example, how certain behavioral interventions can help people feel better because it's better for their brains. So my research question is very broad. I try to understand the interplay between genetic and environmental factors on brain structure into how they construct an individual's behavior. Firstly, to understand the genetic basis of brain structure, I look at twin samples, but also genotype samples in combination with neuroimaging techniques, and I also compare human brains to those of non-human primates, such as macaques. Then I look at differences and similarities across primate species to understand the evolutionary principles that underlie the organization of our brain. Second, to understand how the environment may impact brain structure, I look at the interplay of brain at a certain time point and the time point after, and see how different behavioral changes relate to changes in brain structure. To combine then this question of how genes and environment interplay at the brain, I look at brain microstructure because I think that the organization of the brain is a key answer to understanding how genes and environment systematically impact our brains, shaping the way we think and feel. So, to make this combination, I do a lot of computational approaches describing the map that makes up the brain. So I create a map as if it's a map of a country, and I try to understand where does Hamburg lie, where does Munich lie, how does Leipzig fit in this place? And I think the relationship between these cities is the key answer how genes and environment interplay with the brain, which is also an interplay that dynamically changes across the lifespan. First of all, my key finding is that it's more complex than I thought. So the interplay between genes and environment on brain structure is more nuanced and more specific than I thought before starting answering this question. I could show with the idea of a map that actually if you take a map of the brain, different parts of the brain are set up by different types of genetic factors, likely rooted in development. On the other hand, these different parts of the map are associated with different functions. So we have primary functions such as seeing, hearing, feeling, moving, and these are at certain positions of the brain. And in between these functions, there are more abstract functions that are more difficult to describe, such as theory of mind, thinking about other people, but also memory processing, attention, as well as emotional and motivational processes. Then I could show using a different study that exactly those parts that are more difficult to describe, namely behaviors that are more abstract, they are also in certain positions of the brain and roughly organized at different angles of this space. So if you try to fill up the map, what I'm doing now, you see that there's different domains, although the domains of vision and sensory are more clear island, and what is in between is something that I'm still trying to figure out. Luckily not alone, but a lot of people are thinking about this. And then lastly, I could show in one approach to disentangle these more abstract functions such as empathy and theory of mind, but also attention, that if you train these 3 things, it has a different effect on the brain, suggesting that these behaviors are indeed different and can change also the structure of the brain in specific ways. In further studies, I'm trying to understand what is then changing in the brain and also what genetic factors can be linked to it and what this means for people being different. For example, to what extent do genes contribute to our differences and how much can we change irrespective of our genetic makeup? My findings are relevant both from a basic research perspective as well as from an applied perspective. Starting with the basic research perspective, people have been trying to understand how function relates to brain structure now for over a century. I hope that my work can contribute to this answer by providing models of how brain function and structure interrelate using genetic but also longitudinal models to understand its dynamic interplay through change. Second, I hope that from a more applied perspective, my findings can provide a more nuanced and maybe more hopeful picture on our genetic predisposition versus our environment in how it shapes our brain and behavior. For example, change of the brain is in part mediated by genetic factors, but also the environment matters. So, for example, if you look at the heritability of reading, it matters that you learn to read in school. And if you have not, there will also not be genetic factors involved in reading ability, nor in the brain structures that it supports. On the other hand, I also hope to understand windows of opportunity where the environment is especially impactful in shaping brain structure. For example, other researchers have shown the impact of stress of brain structure and function, so possibly alleviating stress can also help people develop in a more healthy way. What is the outlook of my work? I have created maps to understand the interrelationship between brain structure and its function. This will help to define mechanistic models on how brain and behavior relate to each other. Such models can be informative to understand the interplay between genes and environment in shaping an individual human mind. Ultimately, this can help to inform prevention strategies that may be practiced in schools, but also in aging to promote healthy aging and healthy development. On the other hand, thinking about a completely different aspect of brain and behavior is the application of our approaches and understandings to the applications of algorithms and artificial intelligence. Because the dynamic interpretation that I have between behavior and brain, so between mind and matter, so to say, can also be applied to develop algorithms and to understand how to nuance them in better ways.